Hello and welcome to the Cyberden, your weekly dose of tech and games. I'm Jake the Voice, and I'll be chatting with veteran video game developer David Doak, best known for his work on Goldeneye 64, Perfect Dark, and the iconic TimeSplitters series. Thanks for coming, mate.
No worries, a pleasure to be on the show, Jake.
Now, David, you've graduated from Oxford University with a degree in biochemistry, but for some reason you ended up in game development with Rare, so why so, and how did you get on board with Rare?
Well, my degree was in biochemistry, and then I did a PhD in biochemistry as well. The work that I did was on protein structure, and a lot of the work that I did was not kind of what we used to call wet work in labs. It was working with computers to calculate protein structure and displaying them and stuff. And that was done on what at the time were quite expensive machines called silicon graphics, which did 3D accelerated graphics, which was not a common thing. I always played games, all the kind of Pong stuff as a youngster, which was starting then, and arcade stuff. Was a big fan of Spectrum, so kind of knew Ultimate very well. And it turned out there was an advert in Edge magazine, which was Rare then, wanting to hire a system administrator. So they want someone to come and look after their silicon graphics machines. And the reason Rare had silicon graphics machines was because they had used them for doing the sprite rendering for things like Donkey Kong Country, but also, more importantly, they were doing development for the Nintendo 64. And the Nintendo 64 hardware was built by Silicon Graphics. So all Nintendo 64 development was done on Silicon Graphics machines. So a thing that I had come to know about through science turned out to be very important to the games industry at that time.
How would you describe the development process on Rare's acclaimed shooters like Goldeneye 64 and Perfect Dark 64, and how much creative freedom were you guys given with these games?
I think looking back on it, we were given an extraordinary amount of freedom over what we did. There wasn't really a very well-defined game design document or spec for what Goldeneye was going to be. When I started working on it, the core team, and I mean, in particular, Martin Hollis and Mark Edmonds, who were kind of the architects of the software for it, had been building it, for I think about a year and a half or so, and it made the move to being a kind of free roaming first person shooter at that stage. Other than on Goldeneye, other than the fact that we were doing Bond and it was going to be a bit like the movie, there was no real kind of briefing from the top down or from Nintendo or Rare management. It was very much down to the team, and we pretty much, it was a highly iterative process. We just used to riff on things. Someone would think of something, we would implement it, we would refine it. And a lot of that was made possible by the size of the team. So, the core team was about 8 people. So we all knew each other. We all had good relationships with each other. So, there was a lot of trust and, mutual respect within the team. So it was, looking back, it was very, very hard work. We worked hard. We chose to work hard. But it was actually a very pleasant development process because it was very fulfilling and rewarding.
Would you say there was lots of pressure about how these games would turn out and hold up?
I think about Rare, particularly in the late 90s, is that, and I've spoke with other kind of Rare veterans about this. The people we were competing against, or our expectations, or the benchmark we were trying to meet, was pretty much set by the rest of the company. So at Rare, the teams were generally quite ring-fenced from one another, and there was an enormous amount of and it was good-natured competition, but there was an enormous amount of internal competition for who was making the best stuff. And also, you've got to realize this was kind of, this was still the early days of the web and kind of, game, the visibilities of things in development was much less than it is now. So our frame of reference was the company itself.
Now, both GoldenEye 64 and Perfect Dark They're both very much beloved for their multiplayer modes, especially. I mean, 4-player split-screen multiplayer. How challenging was it to actually get these modes to actually work in the games? Were you given a lot of time, or is it very, like, last minute?
With Goldeneye, I mean, Goldeneye is where it started. So the team were, I mean, we all liked multiplayer games. And we particularly liked split screen stuff. Like on, I mean, a very good example is we played a lot of Bomberman on the SNES. It was a kind of go-to relaxation game when we were doing development. Um, we all knew Doom. You could play Doom on the select graphics machines we were working on. So we used to have network games of Doom every now and again. So the will was always there to make GoldenEye have multiplayer. As development went on, I mean, development was long, took longer than was expected. So the multiplayer was on a wish list of things that we would like to do. And it wasn't until relatively late in the development, so probably I think about 6 months out or something, that Martin had kind of shuffled around people's responsibilities, and it managed to free up Steve Ellis to do the coding and Duncan Botwood to do the design on the multiplayer. So Steve and Duncan basically were in one of our little office rooms, kind of being like a mini team, and dealing with the technical requirements of making the game multiplayer. But it was always intended. It was, if that kind of like late dash to getting it done had failed, it wouldn't have been it wouldn't have been in the final game. It was never announced as being multiplayer until very late in the day. I think Rare management were aware that we were doing it. Nintendo were kind of less aware, but hopeful that we might do it. And in retrospect, without it, I think the game would have been received well, but it certainly wouldn't have become the beloved thing that it ended up being. And I don't think it would be something that people were talking about with kind of reverence and fond nostalgia 22 odd years later.
Looking back on these games now, is there anything that you would have liked to see either implemented or changed? I mean, I ran around, did a bit of research on GoldenEye 64 and Perfect Dark, and I saw that not only GoldenEye 64 was supposed to have quite a bit of violence in it, a bit of blood, but also Joe Dark in Perfect Dark was supposed to have a professional voice actor voicing her.
At the time when we were making GoldenEye, I mean, one of the goals was to make it as realistic as possible. I mean, that's always been. I mean, that's the thing that's driven a lot of the video games industry. It's probably kind of fallen off a little bit now because, there is now the appreciation that old art styles and art styles which were technically limited by hardware are actually have aesthetic value anyway. So all the kind of pixel art and retro stuff that goes on there. With GoldenEye, things like the animation and the modeling, we're all trying to be as faithful to reality as possible. So work was done in making it more violent. There was some blood effects and stuff and things, but they looked a bit too kind of comedic and over the top, so they didn't really fit the tone of the game. So as is, the hit react animations give you a very good visceral indication of what's going on. There's vertex coloring on the characters, so they kind of like they look like they've got some blood on the clothes and stuff and things. We didn't really. I think we got the level of violence right in it. I mean, I don't particularly like games that glorify violence or seem to delight in sort of hyper real depictions of it. I mean, there's obviously there's an ongoing debate about violence in games and whether whether it has any impact on people. I don't think really that it does. I think fantasy violence has always been part of the human condition. And it is possible to enjoy that in a game, but not be a violent person or not be predisposed toward violence. So yeah, I mean, for GoldenEye, I think it was spot on. I mean, Perfect Dark, you talk about the scope of. I was no longer at Rare when the audio was done. Budget wise, Rare, one of the advantages of doing things like character voice in house is the enormous flexibility it affords you, because you don't end up having to record a lot, to author a lot of lines and send them off and have the turnaround from it going to professional voice actors who may not be available or might have limited, times they can do things. The downside of it is obviously you probably don't get as good a performance. Interestingly, at Free Radical, when we did Second Sight, the main character, John Vatic, is voiced by Andrew Lawson, who was one of the animators. And that was, I don't think there's a whole bunch of stuff we couldn't have got in terms of kind of player kind of information dialogue and stuff and things. And, because we were able to identify the need for some breadcrumbing or for some information and write the dialogue and have it recorded pretty much within the hour almost at some times. So it cuts both ways. Another good example is actually a friend from Rare, Richard Lord, who went to work at Valve. He did the placeholder voice for the robot Wheatley or whatever it is in Portal 2, which I think stayed in the game up until very, very late in the day. And I think there was actually internally at Valve, I think they were split as to whether or not they were going to keep his voice work or get it re-recorded, because it was so good.
When did Rare discover how popular these games were? Do you get many people online telling you about all the great memories they had?
There's two things. For Goldeneye, there was the initial popularity of it. When we finished the game, we were proud of it. We thought it was good, but as almost any developer will tell you, when you finish a game, all that you can see are the things that are broken or not as good as you wanted them to be, or you see the list of things on the cutting room floor that you didn't manage to get into it. So it's a kind of it's not so much the case nowadays, but on that generation, you finished the game and that was it. You couldn't touch it anymore. It went out into the world and it was judged as was. So I think, although we were relieved, we were not expecting it to be as well received as it was. So it reviewed very well, and then over was kind of a slow burn in terms of sales, but its popularity and commercial success just grew and grew over the next couple of years. I think we were all probably a bit surprised and delighted by that. It is amazing that it is still so popular and lauded today. And it's been, I'm 52 now. I was 30 when we made the game. It's amazing to meet people, and they generally only have good things to say about it. And one of the nice things is that people often have very fond memories of the multiplayer. At the time when GoldenEye came out, there weren't a lot of options for playing that kind of a game multiplayer easily. It was the time when people playing first person stuff on PC, you needed to have a LAN, you needed to have a whole bunch of machines. The N64, if you had an N64 and 4 controllers in GoldenEye, then you could set up and play split screen multiplayer. And to this day, I think that is one of the highlights of video gaming, is people sitting in the same space, enjoying the social banter and ribbing and kind of tough love that happens when you're playing couch multiplayer. Whether it's a co-op game or a competitive game or whatever, it's a really marvelous thing. It's great to see people coming and sharing memory. And people will come and say, thank you so much for making this thing. And it's actually, well, you were when you were growing up, you were playing with your friends, you were enjoying, the things that everyone does with their friends, and it's really nice to have been part of that, because a game that I was involved in facilitated that in some way.
What are your thoughts on some of the modern remakes of these games, both the fan-made versions and, of course, the The not so great Call of Duty clones that came out about 10 years ago or so.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I mean, I guess the legacy of the games lives on in terms of things like remakes of them, the fan stuff, and also in the ongoing evolution of first-person shooters, multiplayer games. I had it's funny. A couple of weeks ago, I played Goldeneye Source online with the dev team. It was the anniversary of Goldeneye coming out, and they'd reached out to me, and it sounded like a fun thing to do, and in fact, it was a really good fun thing to do, and I really enjoyed playing it. I mean, it seemed to be very. It was on PC, so it was mouse and keyboard controls, but it was incredibly faithful to the spirit and the gameplay of Goldeneye. Um, it was also great fun to be just playing with some people who, I mean, we were playing the game, but actually it was, yeah, we'd stop to chat and stuff when we were doing it. So it was like it was weird. It was like a death match where people were enjoying killing me, but also enjoying asking me questions about the game when we were playing. So yeah, there's also I think there's also GoldenEye 25, which is a again a fan remake. I mean, it looks amazing. The stuff I've seen of it, which is the intention is to have something which allows you to replay the single player game for the 25th anniversary. I mean, with both those things, I really hope they get left alone in terms of IP ownership and things. I think the Bond universe, the GoldenEye itself, is sits in a very strange place because there are so many parties involved in the licensing and ownership of it that it will almost certainly never be re-released on console or anything officially because they just can't agree with each other. But that's actually quite a good thing for people making fan-based stuff because it means they get left alone, which is a good thing. The evolution of first-person shooter games. I mean, obviously, Free Radical, we did a bit more with the TimeSplitters games. I don't play a lot of first-person shooters, although I've recently started playing a few of them again. I like things which are fun and fairly light-hearted. I think GoldenEye actually, even though it was fairly faithful to the Bond universe and the film, managed to embrace some of the kind of playfulness and things, which is often lost. And certainly with TimeSplitters, that was one of our kind of pillars of the thing of the whole branding, which we were kind of making up as we went along, was that it was going to be fun and accessible and entertaining. Things like Call of Duty, it went through stages where it got very, very heavy and, this kind of like grey, brown shooter stuff. It's probably not so much the legacy of GoldenEye, but it is interesting to see how the TimeSplitters legacy, I think, is very strongly reflected in games like Fortnite and Overwatch. Because we were making something which was that kind of chocolate box of lots of variety and not taking itself too seriously. And when we were doing it, people used to, we always had trouble with publishers and branding because people would say, well, we don't really know how to sell this. It has now actually become a fairly commonplace and, in fact, a identifying feature of some of the most successful online games of our time.
So where is it that you and Free Radical Design took inspiration from when you were working on the TimeSplitters trilogy, especially considering all the wacky, goofy, over-the-top kind of characters, weapons, scenarios, etc.? Where did you get all these ideas from?
Well, I think, in a way, having made GoldenEye, one of the things that the team after GoldenEye at Rare was very keen to do was to break out of what we felt were the constraints of having this kind of contemporary militaristic shooter. So that's why you see in Perfect Dark, we very deliberately went for a sci-fi background, and thematically and just everything is all sci-fi because we really wanted, we couldn't really do sci-fi in Bond. We could do the Moonraker lasers and stuff, but that was the kind of limit of it. So That was a big goal with Perfect Dark. For Free Radical, we wanted to make TimeSplitters began life as what we called MPG. It was multiplayer game. It was like, let's make a fast first-person shooter, which is multiplayer. And you know what? Why do we need to be constrained to just one theme? Why don't we just pick all of the kind of movie genres we like and just improvise based on them? So so then you get the obvious things. You got horror and sci-fi and kind of gangster and all those kind of things, and that was really it. It was just we let the artists pretty much pick what they wanted to build. The character design was largely, certainly on the first game, was largely down to one person, Ben Newman, who just was incredibly prolific. I mean, he just Ben's sketchbooks were just a trove of wacky original ideas for characters, and that was it. I mean, we kind of, I guess we pretty much threw the design of the game out to the commons of the people who worked at the company. Nothing was predefined, and nothing was prescribed. There weren't any constraints, and it served us well. I mean, through the trilogy, it's quite kind of interesting how the first game was pretty much I always say it was a bit like our kind of moonshot. Free Radical we wanted to get something shipped. We wanted to prove that we could build a company and ship a game, and we ended up having the opportunity to aim. The time was then constrained, so we made that game. It was bare bones, but it was a good multiplayer game. TimeSplitters 2, we kind of got to fill it out a bit more. We got to put more of the single player story in, kind of expand on the theme. We kind of added the backstory of there being Cortez and Hart, and there being like an anchoring frame for the whole thing. And then I think with TimeSplitters 3, we realized we've been making this wacky stuff and stuff which was humorous and kind of self-knowing anyway. In TimeSplitters 3, we had the opportunity to move that into the narrative. So the game became much more kind of, it repeatedly breaks the fourth wall. It knows what kind of a thing it is. It's got, one of the things I like to think about it is it's got a lot of humor which doesn't try too hard. It's self-effacing, playful with itself, and it's not animations and stuff for TimeSplitters Future Perfect. And I think we were, the company was firing on all cylinders, because a lot of it, I think, remains funny even when you look at it, for the 50th time. So anyway, that's my opinion.
You mentioned before about having to kind of tussle around with publishers, kind of giving you flack with some of your ideas. For example, mapmaker mode on a console? Crazy for like the year 2000. How did you manage to actually persuade the publishers to put a mapmaker in a console game? Because I heard that they weren't too hot about the idea.
Yeah, nobody ever liked the mapmaker on the publisher side. It's interesting, it was born out of, Steve Ellis and I really wanted to do it. It was one of those things. What if you're doing a multiplayer game, what would you like? And it was, again, it has its roots in the fact that the multiplayer in Bond was very limited in the number of levels you could play. We had to cut some levels because they were single player levels which just wouldn't run at any kind of decent speed in 4-player split screen. So we kind of, I think we had a thirst for more content, and also coming to it as games players. Games that we valued had lots of replayability. So adding some kind of user generated content was a way of adding replayability. And we'd also seen that, in the modding scene in the PC world, people were starting to build Goldeneye maps and stuff and things like that. So that was a goal. We also really liked the idea of it being fast. So, if you wanted to, the map makers in TimeSplitters always, you could sit down and within 5 minutes you could have knocked out some kind of map because it's all plug and play. So that was a feature we wanted to have. On the publisher side, I don't know. I mean, I think people are, well, I don't know. I like to think that they're a bit more savvy now, but certainly in at that stage, I would say early 2000s. In a lot of publishers had, I don't know, a fairly disrespectful idea of what the market was. In the, we're saying, well, you make this map maker, people will be able to create things and edit things and add, and then on the publisher side, it'll be, oh, well, most people won't want to do that because most people are very passive. Most people wouldn't have the creativity or the time or the patience to do these things. So it's not something they want. Well, actually, it is. Every iteration of the TimeSplitters franchise, there was pressure to not do it because there was pressure to, streamline the development, not be doing things which seemed to be risky. The map maker was always something which consumed quite a lot of testing time. Because it obviously it does because of the nature of it. It's unpredictable in some ways. But Steve and I were always unshakable on it because it was, I think the bottom line was we regarded it as a feature that we would value as players. And, we were trying to make something which we would like. So that was something that we put in it.
Let's talk about favourites then regarding TimeSplitters. So what are some of your favourite characters, maybe favourite maps, or certainly the favourite TimeSplitters entry in the entire trilogy?
I think all of us are kind of torn between TimeSplitters 2 and TimeSplitters 3 or Future Perfect, just because they do play slightly differently. And I think also there's a lot of content that went into TimeSplitters 2, which we were incredibly proud of at the time. Future Perfect, I was less actively involved in the development on a day-to-day basis because I was working on second sight for a lot of the time. I don't know. I mean, Future Perfect also. I mean, I love the way in Future Perfect there's just lots of, as you play through it, it does feel like the game is redefined. The story game, it kind of feels like it's redefining its scope all the time. There's always something new to do. You start off, you get driving the vehicles and stuff, and the Scottish level, just it presents itself in a certain way. But then later you've got the robots, and then in the eugenics stuff, you've got the kind of slow motion stuff and the blowing things up, and bursting characters and stuff and things like that. In terms of favorite, I mean, I think the kind of the characters that ended up being the main story characters in Future Perfect, I think ended up kind of being slightly elevated above the other characters just because they get more screen time and they get more time to emote some personality. So particularly the core relationship, I mean, the relationship between Cortez and Harry Tipper, I think is very funny. And also, I mean, the Captain Ash character, Amy Chen is a great character just because of the incredible dryness of it. It's like she's there trying to do this fairly serious, Ghost in the Shell kind of sci-fi spy thing, and there's this buffoon in the middle of it. And also the Jo Beth Casey character, which I think is a great. As time's gone on, one of the things I really like about Times, I mean, I know some of the content has dated in terms of the sexualization and stuff and things. There's some stuff which I don't think we would do again. However, I think one of the great things about the game was that, yes, we had lots and lots of characters, but it was incredibly diverse and gender inclusive for its time. Every story level from the start, there were a male and female character, and you could choose. I think for a game that was made in the early 2000s in Nottingham by a largely white male workforce, it's got a lot of ethnic diversity in the characters and stuff, and that all I'm very pleased to say that all happened very naturally. It wasn't some tokenism. It was just people's desire to make that kind of a game. Things that have become kind of almost like a necessary component in games now. If you look at the kind of diversity, I mean, it's brilliant. It's brilliant that it's happening. But I like to think that we kind of subscribed to that before it became something which had a lot of publicity associated with it. It was just something that we chose to do. I'm not sure that answers the question, but I was trying to think of things about it that I'm looking back proud of.
Okay, if I was to put you on the spot and point at you and say, one character, favourite, TimeSplitters, go, would anyone come to mind?
I think it's probably Harry Tipper, actually. I just is a funny character, and particularly in 3, I think he kind of found himself in 3. The whole stuff about having to dress up as and only having the female costumes to get into the spy thing and stuff is great fun. Aesthetically, I've always loved the Gretel characters, the Gretel robot. It's not a character that's well developed in the fiction, but particularly I think the TimeSplitters 2 one, it's the robot, and it identifies as being female, I suppose, has this red hooded kind of cowl thing. So it's like a robot that wears some clothes, but not very many clothes. It's just. And I've always thought that character is a really nice character because it just hints at something, that it's a robot that wears clothes. So that's 2, I guess. The longer I go on talking, I'll just start picking all the other ones.
Okay, then. So who would you say has to be quite possibly the weirdest, most bizarre character you've ever seen implemented in any of the TimeSplitters games?
There's probably one that we wouldn't ever do again, which is there's the Hans character in Future Perfect, who's some kind of weird, deformed gimp character in bondage gear. I think that would be quite hard to fly with now. The one that I think is absolutely superb, and again, it's a testimony to Ben's just bonkers creativity, is the shoal character in Future Perfect, which is basically a kind of little cartoon whale with some fish. And he was just seeing, it was basically a experiment in seeing how unusual a character model you could make and still rig it up to the human animations. So yeah, it's like a cartoon whale with some fish, and it can carry a gun. Oh, and all the ones like RoboFish that Fortnite have stolen as well.
Not like they'll ever admit it, of course.
No, but I think there's certain similarities.
Now, with TimeSplitters Future Perfect especially, you had EA on board with publishing. I don't think I need to ask much about how much of a pain they must have been.
I think I was just tweeting about it the other day. Someone raised it on Twitter. They had a picture of the TimeSplitters presence at E3 that year, and EA had put us on the back of the booth. So, and then tried to tell us it was the best place to be because it got a lot of foot traffic. It was just depressing, really. I think EA. I mean, it's really easy to bash EA. But they have also done some absolutely amazing things. It's a company that over a long period of time sometimes is doing really, really great stuff and sometimes doing absolutely lousy, horrible stuff. And often it does both things at once. TimeSplitters ended up with EA because they kind of came to us and they were interested in it, and we were not terribly thrilled with how well TimeSplitters 2 had done. With IDOS, we kind of felt IDOS didn't have the muscle. We went with EA, and it was there was a collision of cultures, I guess, to some extent in making the game. But I mean, I think the game came out really, really well in the end. I think EA let us down in terms of the marketing and push that they gave to it, and that probably meant that well, I think that was the start of the end for Free Radical, because it meant that we were hard pressed to do TimeSplitters 4. People weren't so interested in it. And we kind of fell out with EA over the course of doing it with them. So looking back on it, it was just a bit sad, because if that game had been as successful as it could have been, if it had been well handled by the publisher, I think things would have gone very differently. But I don't think EA is full of bad people. I think the culture is sometimes not great, coming down from the executive level. And also, look at the people who are the execs. Yeah, they're all just there. I mean, it's the same the world over in lots of things. You get people, and they're only interested in their personal careers. So, all the execs, they all move on and they go and work somewhere else. That we used to always say that, actually, when Steve and I were talking to publishers at Free Radical. We get people saying to us, well, what guarantee do we have about what your company's doing? And we would say, well, look at us. I mean, we're the people who've set the company up. We're still actively involved in it. People don't leave our company. It's an ongoing thing, and there's a big commitment to what we believe in, and people who work here generally are aligned with the company. And then on the publisher side, it's like every 6 months the bell rings and everyone changes positions, or they go and the person who was fanatical about Sony is now fanatical about Microsoft, or is now fanatical about EA, or is now fanatical about Zynga, or is now fanatical about this. They're just they're career people. They happen to be in the games industry, but I don't know whether some of them actually like games. I need to stop now.
What could have we expected from TimeSplitters 4 exactly? Is there anything you're legally able to tell us about it?
It never went much further than a whole bunch of concept art and starting to think about how things might work mechanically and what differences we might make to it. I think it would have always been a hard project, because certainly the flow of those 3 first games was that every one of them was just a bigger superset of everything that had gone before. And that's a challenge for the TimeSplitters brand, because it's core things were variety and content, and encompassing that just becomes a bigger and bigger task. So we had there was some. I mean, there was some really nice. I mean, one of the key art things that I think has persisted, a concept art that was leaked, is a thing of, it's the JoBeth character, and she's she's no longer the kind of wisecracking preppy college girl. She's now a nun, and instead of the slut t-shirt, she's wearing a thing that says saint on it, and she's got a chainsaw, and she's chainsawing zombies. And it's just, it's to me that kind of screams TimeSplitters, because it's a mashup, but it's a mashup that actually, when you look at it, when I look at that image, I can just see, I know what that is. I know, I could imagine it as a movie. It's also referencing I can't remember what it's called. Is it Dusk Till Dawn or something? The Selma Hayek thing with the vampires in the kind of like Mexican mission church in the desert or something. Because I think that's another thing about TimeSplitters, is it's not the theming of the levels. The mashup happens when you take all the things in the multiplayer, but everything revolves around these well-defined themes, which are self-consistent internally. So if it's the zombies in the mansion, then that is zombies in the mansion, and that's how it works. If it's Robot Factory with science weapons, that's how it works. I think a lot of the modern stuff loses sight of that. So things like, Fortnite. It doesn't. I don't know what the core identity of it is. I mean, it is a mashup of lots of things, but I don't know what underpins it. Don't know whether that makes any sense or not. But it's kind of just a feeling I have about it.
Here's another golden question I want to drop on your shoulders. What are your thoughts on TimeSplitters Rewind, the fan-made kind of spiritual sequel or kind of bigger mashup, whatever you want to call it? What are your thoughts on TimeSplitters Rewind?
I've not played it. I've looked at some of the stuff online, and I think what you can see there is when I was describing even as a professional developer trying to with full-time employees and people who it's their job, doing something like that would be hard because there's a lot of work to do, and there are choices to make, and but I think Rewind, it's probably suffered from the fact that, I mean, when you've got something which is being made by volunteers in the spare time, and you have a kind of churn in the number in the people who are making it. It's a hard project to actually close or to converge on some release of. It's funny, when I was talking to the Goldeneye source people a couple of weeks ago, I was asking them about that, and they were saying that that's one of the things they're quite proud of with Goldeneye source is that it's been going for, I think, like, I don't know, about 9 years or something, and they have that people have joined and left the team, but it's actually they've managed to keep a release version working. They have they choose goals, they stick to goals. They've got they're doing the project management, which is necessary. So Rewind. Look, I mean, there's been some recent stuff which looks really great, which is just stuff in UE4. So yeah, I mean, it's a big task, but it's great to see the love that's going on there for TimeSplitters.
THQ swiped up the TimeSplitters IP. So do you believe that there is indeed possibility of a HD remake coming soon for TimeSplitters? Do you think the world is ready for more?
It comes up consistently as a game. I mean, I see it. A classic thing is Switch. I mean, I don't know whether hardware is I thought it would be capable. It's like, oh, it'd be great to have Goldeneye multiplayer on Switch or TimeSplitters on Switch. I mean, I really like Switch. I just love I love the way in the same way that the N64 supported that split screen thing. Switch, it is possible to cluster some people in a pub around a Switch and play some multiplayer thing. Split even though the screen's tiny, or to plug it in somewhere. That stuff is great. Yeah, there's been no announcement about what may or may not happen. I think it's announced that Steve's working on something, but to me it would be an obvious. We always wanted to do a TimeSplitters remastered. I know when PSP came out, we wanted to do it on that. We wanted to do it on PS3. We annoyingly from Sony, we just got friction. Classic Sony kind of third-party relationship. You'd go and you'd say this, and Sony, you would go, well, if you're going to put it on PSP, what new features are you going to put on it to make it to showcase the hardware? You're not just going to do a straight remaster. Well, why don't we just do a straight remaster? Because people want it. I think if we'd been first party or closer to Sony, that would have been something that just would have happened. But there's a bit of hypocrisy there, which I get. It's they're in the business of selling hardware, so I understand. Yeah, it would be because it gets harder for people to experience TimeSplitters. The act of going and getting an old copy and getting an old console and playing it is becoming increasingly difficult. So yeah, it would be nice to see it have some legs.
All right then, let's move away from the TimeSplitters series. Let's talk about some of the other games and also your time in indie development. So you were talking a bit about Second Sight. What was that game all about exactly, and how successful was that for the company? Just tell us a bit more about the development and the ideas behind it, etc.
Well, so Second Sight was actually going to be the first game that Free Radical were going to make. It was originally going to be called Redemption, and it was originally going to be first person. And the idea is that it's it's got a kind of dual narrative with flashback in it, and you're this character, John Vatic, who is he's supposed to be a scientist, but he's very cynical about psychic abilities and stuff, and he gets put in a situation where he realizes that they're true. So it's split across some stuff that goes on in Russia and stuff that goes on in America. I'm really proud of it. I mean, I pretty much wrote all of the story and planned out how all of the complicated interconnections between the narratives. I think we did an amazing job of making something which kind of, one of the things that it was trying to play a bit like was Metal Gear. So it's third person, it's got stealth and combat, and it's got these psychic abilities. It didn't do as well as it might have done. We we strangely launched. We thought we were making a unique game about psychic abilities in a kind of like action shooter stealth thing, and then another game called Psyops came out at exactly the same time. The development of it was troubled because we were at one stage doing it with Activision, who turned out to be probably even worse than EA because they cancelled it. It was a really fun game to work on. I think it's a really interesting property. It's a really interesting idea. I think probably now it resides with THQ Nordic as well as part of the deal that they did. Certainly, it's probably like, whenever I see kind of nostalgic kind of retro, let's revisit this game, Second Sight crops up every now and again, and generally people regard it as being one of those kind of forgotten treasures, and it's really, really nice to see people revisiting it and enjoying it so much. It was again also the team. It was part of Free. It was actually a large part of the TimeSplitters 2 team who worked on that, and it was another one of these cases where a lot of things in the game which are really, really good in terms of set dressing and expanding the world and stuff and things, were pretty much made up on the fly by the dev team as they were doing it, which again reflects the kind of development environment we had. There was a lot of trust in people's abilities, and it wasn't just here's a list of tasks that have been handed down from on high. People really cared about the game and wanted to make it better and wanted to improve and add to it. So yeah. It was a troubled development because the publisher went completely mad, as far as I can remember, halfway through. It was Activision just culling a whole bunch of third-party stuff and being incredibly abusive about it when they did it. And they basically, they tried to put Free Radical out of business at that time, but we survived. So yeah. There's always scars with these things.
Haze, one question, why?
So why was because after TimeSplitters Future Perfect, EA didn't want to do another TimeSplitters game. And we did. So we were talking to other, and EA didn't, I think EA just didn't want to work with us. Well, we didn't want to work with them. So we'd exhausted our pool of people to talk to. So we went and talked to loads of people. And almost everyone we spoke to said, oh, we don't want this kind of TimeSplitters thing because we don't know how to sell it. It's just a bit silly. People like military shooters. They like stuff which is just not wacky. So we kind of reluctantly started pitching things in that direction. And we ended up, I actually really enjoyed working with Ubisoft. I've got tremendous respect for Ubisoft. One thing about Ubisoft, which is in stark contrast to a lot of the other big publishers, is that the people who run Ubisoft are the people who created Ubisoft. So Yugimo, Serge Haskell, Alan Carin, the guys who we were talking to 10 years ago are still there. It's a big public company, but it's a company run by people who actually like games, which is good. So we ended up dealing with them. And I think, unfortunately, we weren't, even though they were great people to work with, it was still that relationship between a publisher and an external developer, which can be a really bad relationship because there's both ways. There's always the publisher's always thinking, as a developer, are we getting value out of the developer? They're spending all this money, and then the developer's always thinking, well, you know what, it's a bit hypocritical because first-party internal development at publishers generally is protected in all kinds of ways that you aren't if you're external. So it's a slightly fraught relationship. Anyway, we had pitched a kind of a horrors of war kind of game was the idea for Haze. It was going to be, you know, it's a shooter, and at one point we were thinking it might be third person actually, I think. But the idea is that you're in a war and it's an unjust war, and you realise that you're on the wrong side. So it's not the most original idea in the world, but I thought we had an interesting story, and you know it was. It's funny watching Ubisoft currently. I mean, I think Guillermo just made some statements the other day about how difficult it is to do politics in games, and how people judge you for the politics of games. I mean, who would do something? It was, I guess, slightly political as well. The thing that killed it was, well, two things. One was that although we were trying to do this horror of war thing, we were being pushed toward making it kind of a low age rating. So inevitably, it was kind of hobbled and hamstrung by the fact that we were trying to do conflicting things. And then the other thing was technology. So we had come off the back of doing all the TimeSplitters games and Second Sight, which all used the same engine. Although it wasn't an engine that sat aside from the games. It was you know, the games and the engine were much the same thing at that point. And we were moving to the next generation of consoles, so PS3, X360, and we decided at Free Radical that we would make our new technology, and it killed us because it was a much harder transition than we thought it was going to be. And it wasn't just us, because many other developers and many other internal studios in that transition failed. A lot of it got covered up by the fact that Unreal Engine saved a lot of people, because that's what publishers, internal studios and publishers, where the technology failed, often it was covered up by them buying in Unreal. We didn't have that option. So Haze was I mean, the team on Haze killed themselves. They worked really, really hard, but I think the technology problems meant that we only got to start making the game properly months before it came out, because up until that stage we were fighting with the technology, and we couldn't have a proper conversation with Ubisoft about it, because they probably would have killed the project. So, you know, there was always some guardedness about that. I think they understood what was going on. But anyway, yeah. So my regret there is that I think we kind of found a publisher we could work with and respected, but just the parameters of the time and the project conspired against us. Does that answer it? Sorry, this is all a bit dark.
Eventually, after that, you kind of ventured into indie development. Then you went off to do lectures about gaming.
Steve and I at one point dabbled with doing Facebook stuff shortly after I left Free Radical, and Free Radical had folded. That was interesting. It became clear that we couldn't compete with. I mean, Facebook was a very strange platform because it moved incredibly quickly. I mean, people probably don't remember any of this now, but it was like the Wild West in the early, I guess, 2009, 2010, because people were putting apps on Facebook which were invading people's feeds and doing all kinds of stuff. And it was just bonkers, and it pretty much changed every week. And we made something which was not bad. It was a kind of like click and collect kind of vaguely story. It was like gangster. It was called Gangster Pets. It was a mashup between the kind of like gangster clicker games, and it had a notional kind of like craft your own little cartoon characters at the same time. But it was impossible to compete with people like Zynga at the time, who clearly had deep access into Facebook. So, even though the rules and the platform were changing, and Zynga games seemed to know about the changes before they happened. So something would change, it would break everyone's games apart from Zynga's games. But also, it's funny looking back on that, it was the start, that was the start of the abomination that free to play became. So all these things were, there was no upfront money, and then it was just the start of the cancer that that ended up being loot boxes. So it was fun to be involved with, but it was, I don't really understand how that works. So did that. I live in Norfolk now. In rural Norfolk. I ended up spending a lot of time doing primary school work. So first of all, in after school clubs, playing around with robots and animation, and there's a great visual coding environment called Scratch, which is brilliant, which is great for kids learning just learning how to create things. It's not about learning how to program. It's about learning how to be creative with computers, because I think that's a really, really important thing. It's like the most amazing authoring technology ever available to humans is on computers, and I mean that's what the great things about games. Games are the fusion of artistry and creation and technology, and I think if the world was more enlightened, then there'd be a lot more of the playful, creative use of computers in schools from an early age. Unfortunately, that requires money. Basically, it requires money to train teachers to be able to work in that space, and that's always the problem with public education, is finding the money to do it. Anyway, I had the privilege of and had some great times working with primary school kids, doing all that kind of stuff, and just it's brilliant because kids actually want to make things, and they're all incredibly game literate. So you can have, it's one of the most amazing things. You can actually, with 10-year-olds, you can have good discussions about game design because it's something that they've grown up with. So they have opinions about it and they can articulate it. I mean, that's it. It's cross-curricular. Articulating opinions about game design is as valuable as having a debating club or something. It's causing people to think and present their ideas well, communication, all of that kind of stuff. I'll stop now. I could rant a lot about that. More recently, I've been involved with Norwich University of the Arts, where there's a games art and design course, and now also a games development BSc course. And I'm a part-time lecturer there. I don't actually often do what you would call lecturing. I mostly do kind of mentoring and support and helping students to, again, articulate their ideas about things they want to make, about scoping their ideas so they don't try over ambitious things, about how important it is to, if you're making a game, you're going to be making the game with other people, and you've got to be able to communicate with them and to deal with, the good times and also the inevitable friction when people struggle with work, or they, it's teamwork. It's essential. And I mean, and the great thing about teamwork, particularly, well, in any creative endeavor, but in games, is that, if teamwork is going well, then it basically just multiplies the scope of what people can do. You can achieve amazing things.
David, it's been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for coming on board.
My pleasure. Yeah.
And I'd like to thank all my wonderful listeners out there for checking out The Cyber Den, your weekly dose of tech and games. See you later, David. Good luck out there, and thank you so much for all those great memories.
Cheers, Jake.